One thing that we had advertised in terms of the organizers is that we were settlers or non-Indigenous people in solidarity with Idle No More. So I know Chickadee is going to probably be saying quite a bit more about that, but I thought I would just read something from a teach-in toolkit that was available online about the history of Idle No More. Idle No More is a grassroots movement with groups spread across Canada with solidarity around the globe. Idle No More is a call for action, for a resurgence of our Indigenous nativehood and sovereignty, and for defending the land, water, and air. It started in Saskatchewan by Sheila McLean, Sylvia McAdam, and Jess Gordon, and Nina Wilson, in response to federal legislation in Ottawa that would threaten Indigenous nationhood and territories. And if you wanted to go online, there's a whole very detailed list about all the bills that our government is attempting to carry out. Idle No More ignited grassroots action throughout rallies, flash mobs, marches, teach-ins, and gatherings to stand up to government threats and actions. The people, lands, waters, and air will be affected, and thus our nation will be idle no more. So with that, I believe Rochelle, where are you? Rochelle is going to introduce Tasha, our speaker from the Treaty Relations Commission.
Hello. So my name is Rochelle Devine. I'm the project coordinator for the Speakers Bureau at the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. So just a brief background, the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba, TRCM, is a neutral body created through a partnership between the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, AMC, and Canada, with a mandate to strengthen, rebuild, and enhance the treaty relationship with mutual respect between First Nations and Manitobans. The TRCM will enhance and maintain positive intergovernmental relations and cooperation, conduct independent research that advances discussion on treaty-related issues, and facilitate public understanding of the importance and role of treaty making in building a stronger and healthier nation. Mandate: the Commission has received a 3-year extension on its mandate and will function to engage in public education to improve the understanding of treaties and the treaty relationship, to provide facilitation service for discussing treaty issues, conduct independent research. So with that, the TRCM is pleased to have Tasha as part of our growing Speakers Bureau. The Speakers Bureau is a unique opportunity for the community to have discussions such as this about treaties and the treaty relationship in a sharing and engaging way. While the TRCM remains neutral as an independent organization from our partners, it remains neutral in respect to current affairs and historical issues as they relate to treaty. The Speakers Bureau member, Tasha, will present her independent perspective on treaty, and the TRCM wishes to note that it does not necessarily endorse the comments provided. The responsibility to the end user audience to further research and dialogue to develop their understanding of the topic. If you have any questions, however, relating specifically to the TRCM mandate, please feel free to go on our website, check out our Facebook page, find us on Twitter, email, or call our office directly. And with that, Tasha is a PhD candidate at the Department of English, University of Calgary, and an award-winning filmmaker. She was a Sutherland lecturer at the First Nations University of Canada from 1995 to 97, and then turned to casting and documentary filmmaking. Her film projects have been screened at festivals across North America and broadcast on CBC and the Aboriginal Peoples Television Network. Her last solo directing project, Two Worlds Colliding, won the Canada Award at the 2005 Geminis. Her current film and academic world focuses social justice, Indigenous women's leadership, Indigenous theories within Indigenous knowledge, and transformation through art. Her topics include history of buffalo in North America, First Nations historical use of resources land, treaty land entitlement, and Saskatchewan treaties. And here she is.
Hello, good evening. So my name is Tasha Hubbard, and I come from Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories in what's now known as Saskatchewan. And I'm just going to begin, I guess, by telling you a little bit about my background, because it has led to where I am now, and the kind of perspective that I bring both to my films and also to my academic career as well. So I come from a sort of two interesting histories. My dad is the grandson of John Tatousis, who was one of the first national political leaders, Cree leaders, and is known for the resistance that he and others did in the 1940s at a time when the Indian Act forbade political organizing, forbade leaving the reserve without permission, and basically put things in place in order to continue the subjugation of Indigenous peoples. And so through his family, my dad was given a lot of history, and specifically around the treaties. And in the work that he's done, through his parents, he still speaks what's known as High Cree, which is a lot of the older words that aren't necessarily in everyday conversation. And as a result, in the 1990s, when the Office of the Treaty Commission, which is the Saskatchewan counterpart to the Manitoba Treaty Relations Committee, he was asked to be the interpreter. So he went around, when they went and interviewed all of the elders about treaty, he was the one who then simultaneously interpreted for the English speakers, which was the Treaty Commissioner and his team. That's my dad's side. Residential school survivor, as him and his brothers. And so on my mom's side, she is, originally her family is from the Sakamay Reserve, which is Soto, or Plains Anishinaabe. When her grandfather and his brother were traveling to the Cypress Hills, which many people did, they happened upon some Jesuit priests who apprehended the two young boys and took them to residential school. When they came of age, there was a bureaucrat within Indian Affairs who had been given permission to conduct a social experiment in which they arranged marriages between graduates of the residential school with Métis women graduates from a Métis day school. And the couples, 15 of them, were chosen based on their traits, physical, otherwise, and were arranged in marriages. So that's my great-grandparents. They then took the Papikasis First Nation, which is a Cree reserve, pushed all the inhabitants to one side of the reserve, and gave that land to the 15 couples, the rest of the land. And they were given houses, their children were given a baseball team, a band, all of these sort of benefits. And then, of course, they took their pictures like crazy and spread them all over the newspapers and said, look, this is what can happen, right? If you have, this is what is the potential, right? But not telling the other story, right? Not telling the history, not telling about the displacement, not telling about the waves of trauma that had happened, but basically turning them into photo opportunities. What they also didn't tell was that the couples, in order to have these benefits, had to promise not to practice their spirituality and not to speak their language, nor pass those on to their children. So that was the legacy of my mom's family, also multi-generational residential school survivors. So I came along in the early 70s. My mother was one of the few treaty women to be in university in 1972. My dad had done a number of things, but at that time he was heading off to Montreal to work for the National Film Board. And so I've repeated history a little bit because I ended up working with them as well. And they gave me up for adoption. I was supposed to go to a family member, but that didn't work out, and my mother ended up giving me up through a program called Adopt Indian and Métis, with the acronym of AIM, which is a bit ironic. I don't think they knew that, what was going on at the time, because that was right around Wounded Knee, the 40th anniversary of which is, I think, tomorrow. No.
I'm not.
Okay, hug. And then you gotta go, remember? You got your stuff. So I grew up in a non-Native family. I was adopted into a settler family. My grandparents are from a family that have a heritage homestead. We celebrated the 100th anniversary of the homestead 2 years ago, on both my adopted father and adopted mother's sides. And I grew up within that atmosphere, farming, and actually learned a lot from my grandpa about, you know, as a newcomer, he had a deep appreciation for the land that he lived. He had prairie that that had been unbroken. He told me once, he took me up onto a hill where we used to go all the time, and he confessed that as a young man he'd broken more of the prairie, and he said that in his whole entire life was his biggest regret, was breaking that virgin prairie. And he had kept one sort of hill, and he said, you know, this all used to be this kind of land, and I really, really wish I'd never done that. And so as a young woman, I went looking for my birth parents, and I found them when I was just turned 16 when I found them. And, you know, I mean, it was one of those interesting histories where I'm learning about this, you know, the settler perspective and the love of the land and, you know, coming there, but my family not really having, or not wanting to think about how it is they came to have the land that they had, right? Even though my grandpa would go out and he would find arrowheads and he would find stone tools on his land, I mean, acknowledged it, but didn't take it that next step, right? In terms of how did I come upon to have this land? How did my parents get this land, right? And have it as theirs and own it, you know, as property. And so I didn't grow up with that idea either, right? It was like we'd been, you know, my actual ancestors had been erased, right? Just leaving remnants that you see, right? But there weren't any reserves where I'd grown up. You know, I think the nearest one was actually in Montana. And so as far as I understood, Indigenous people really only existed on TV and in Westerns, and they all died, right? That was usually the case. So when I was 16 and I met my parents, and my mother is a writer, my dad's a lawyer, so they started to talk about this history, right? And of course, like most people my age and your age as well, I think it's only now that it's little kids like this that are starting to get some of that history, but obviously I had none of that either. And it was really overwhelming. You know, it was really overwhelming to get told the truth, because it was the first time I'd ever heard it. And at 16, it was like, oh my God, like it was like this huge, like, brain, you know, shift that had to happen. And it was difficult, right? It's difficult to let go of the truths you think you have, right? And I mean, I worked on a police documentary where I, you know, showed abuse of power in policing. Well, I grew up thinking that police always protected everybody. That's what I'd always been told, right? You go to the police if you have a problem. And so making that film, again, was another one of those, like, it's only like that for certain people who have privilege, right? Privilege that comes from the color of skin, privilege that comes from your economic background, privilege that comes from an upbringing where you're not forced to confront those truths, right? And that's what I had until my teen years. So I basically started to deal with all of that and then freaked out and closed off and went, I can't, this is too much, right? I wanted to hold on to that beautiful, comfortable narrative of pioneers and, you know, all of that. I didn't want to let go of that. I didn't want to acknowledge that one side of my family, who I loved very much, displaced my other family, right? I didn't want to deal with that. So when I was 21, I had a degree by then, and I came back to Saskatchewan. I moved to Alberta briefly, came back to Saskatchewan, and thought I'd move home. You know, I was going to be one of those overgrown teenagers that just never actually leaves home. And my adopted parents had other ideas about that. And so I went to visit my birth dad, and he said, come on over, come stay with me. And I did. And I started traveling with him because I thought, okay, I want to actually get to know my dad. I'm done running, I'm done hiding. And so I used to travel for him. He was a land claims lawyer, worked with bands to retrieve land that had been stolen, had been appropriated, had never gotten before, the land that they were supposed to get under treaty. And I had never heard about treaties at that point. I think I was 22. I'm like, I had no idea that I grew up in Treaty 4 territory. I had no idea that my family had ties, you know, my dad's family is Treaty 6. So he started to talk to me about that. And that's how I basically have learned what I have today, is what he started on those road trips. And then realize, and then it's interesting with treaties, once you get a little bit, it's like it's not enough, right? And it's been this ongoing thing for me. I started working with the Office of the Treaty Commissioner in 1999, doing their public education, and traveling with elders. And we went and traveled all over the province of Saskatchewan, giving treaty talks to organizations, to schools, and sometimes to corporations as well. And as it was one of those times when I was traveling and driving for a man who's now passed on, and we were passing through oil country, which is around Lloydminster. It's where the oil industry first began in Saskatchewan, and now it's really entrenched, and it's entrenched in other places as well. And I remember, one of the first things I learned from my dad is that whenever you take something, you need to give something back, right? There's a basic ethic there that sort of underlies. And I'm looking and I'm thinking about all this oil that's being taken, and I asked him, I said, what do you think about that? Like, what do you think about these oil wells? And he came from that area. And that's what he said to me. He said, I look at all of this and I always wondered, is anybody giving back? What are they giving back? And I thought, yeah, is anyone thinking about that? The other thing that really became apparent to me, and especially through my mom's side of the family, is the displacement that's happened, right? And it's been purposeful and strategic, right? That separation of Indigenous people and those beliefs and those ethics and those morals and those guidelines and those laws that we have, right? That separation has absolutely been on purpose. And it's been effective in some ways, right? And so, I realized at that point too that this is a really complex situation, because we have, a system in place that absolutely wants access to these resources and has from the very beginning. It's always been about the resources, right? I'm just going to give a little caveat. I'm just learning about the Treaty 1 territory in Manitoba. I'm a newcomer here. It's the first time, other than my 4-month stint experiment living in Banff, being young and wild and crazy, which lasted all of 4 months. I've always lived in Saskatchewan, so that's the history I know. And so I've asked my dad, well, why did the treaties happen, like, from a government perspective? I knew from the Indigenous perspective, right? And my research area, as I said before, is buffalo. And I've looked at specifically what was our relationship to buffalo? How did we understand ourselves to be in kinship and in relationship to buffalo? For Anishinaabe, for Nahio people, there was a grandfather, sort of grandparent, grandchild relationship. For the Blackfoot, it's an older brother. For Lakota, it's an older brother. But what that does is it places a person in a relationship that is interdependent, right? We rely on you and you rely on us. And so that ethic had been underpinning. So when the buffalo disappeared, right, I've been told that to understand that as another wave of trauma, right? The first wave of trauma being the diseases and the epidemics that wiped out sometimes 90% of a specific tribe, right? The second wave being that purposeful slaughter of the buffalo. And the third wave being residential schools and the laws that came, the oppressive laws that came around. So, there's many good reasons, for those separations and for us being disconnected at times, right, to that. Luckily, that's not everybody, right? There's always been those people, those knowledge keepers in our communities that have held on to that. And we're really fortunate for that. So when it came to the treaties, the buffalo were gone, people were hungry, right? It was understood very clearly that we had to make changes, that we couldn't continue this life. We wanted to preserve as much of that as we could, and that's what we went in saying, okay, and that's what we were told. That's what the treaty commissioner, who was Alexander Morris, who negotiated the earlier numbered treaties, had said. You will be able to continue your life in the land that's set aside for your exclusive use. And you agree to share the other land, and we will all benefit from it. And they did. They agreed to share to the depth of a plow. And that's independent elder testimony across the way. You can go to any community, go and ask the knowledge keeper, the historian, the elders, and I've asked 3 or 4 elders in my research and my time what was agreed to. And they all will tell it's the depth of a plow, right? 6 to 12 inches, depending how big your plow is, I guess. And so, that was agreed to be shared. That was agreed to be shared for the mutual benefit of everybody living together. And because we already had ideas of understandings of kinship, and because we had already had alliances that we made prior to contact, right? So my dad is Cree and Nakota. My mom is Saulteaux and Métis, right? And those 4 nations make up the Iron Alliance. And that's been in place for centuries, right? That was pre-contact. That was an understanding of how to share this land, because everybody needs the same resources. Everybody needs the same territory. So it was an agreement to come together and function in that way. So when it was time to make treaty, we already understood that. We understood, okay, we know this isn't a nation-to-nation agreement. We've done this before. We will, adopt a kinship understanding, right? Which is why in the language of the treaties, the queen becomes the grandmother, the settlers become brothers, right? And we had good faith that the people that were entering into these negotiations with us understood, and they used that language as well, right? If you talk to the oral historians, that's what they'll say. We made that agreement. And on our side, we made that agreement under sacred circumstances, right? That went into that. Oftentimes the treaty negotiations are characterized as everybody came together for a day or two, right? And sat down and all the men sat in a circle and talked, and then that was it. The agreement was struck. But it actually was much longer than that. And it involved not just the men who were the spokespeople, but it involved the women as well. Not to say that there is complete agreement across the way, right? There were those leaders who didn't trust. Said, I don't think this is gonna work. I don't think they're gonna live up to this. From what I've observed and what I've seen, right? And there were certain leaders that thought that, but there were others who said, this is the path that we have to go down, right? This is going to ensure that our children continue to live. So that was their intent, right? That their livelihood could continue. There was the buffalo, Big Bear and Sweetgrass both asked that the buffalo be protected, what was left at that time. The buffalo went from 30 to 60 million, depending on who you listen to. And at their low point in the 1890s, they figured there was between 250 to 500 left. At the time of treaty, they were numbered in the thousands. And so the attempt was made to hold on to those. But they realized that they needed to make a change in life, and that meant farming, because that was the economy of the day. So they asked for farming implements, right? Plows, hoes, twine, bullets, all the things that they needed to continue to have livelihood, right? And you think about treaty, people tend to want to interpret, and I say people by settlers and descendants of settlers, as very literal, but they're not. They're not literal. It's not just literally bullets, right? Bullets mean the right to hunt, right? Farm implements means the right to a livelihood. In Treaty 4, the elders and the people that were watching these treaty negotiations, and they learned from each other, right? Whatever happened in Treaty 1, Treaty 2, Treaty 3, Treaty 4, Treaty 5, everybody looked back and said, okay, well, what did they ask for, right? What needs to be done? And it was also negotiated in Treaty 8 that whatever applied in one treaty territory applies through all 11, right? So in Treaty 4, they said, we're watching and we're seeing, these pen scratchings on paper, and the power that comes with that. And the old people said, we need to ask for the power of the pen. We need our children to have that ability. And they didn't mean it in the sense that they gave up all they gave up all of their own ways of teaching and continuing knowledge. It wasn't an or situation, it was an and, right? We also need to know how to do this. And so they negotiated for schools on the reserves, right? But that, again, is not just literally, a little brick schoolhouse, right? That is the best education that's available, right? That's what they asked for. Similarly in Treaty 6, right? Epidemics had been coming through. People understood how much of their population had been impacted as a result of the diseases. And they had seen these military come in, and the police come in with these great big chests. Has anyone ever seen an old medicine chest? No? I have. I went and looked for one. The one I saw is smaller than some of the older ones, but the one I saw was about like that, and it was just built in layers and shelves of little bottles, right? Different medicines. And they had seen these being used, and they said, we need that too. We need to have the access to any means to make ourselves well. We have our own ways. Doesn't mean we're going to give all those up. We have our own medicines and our own knowledge and our own ways of healing, but we also want access to this, right? And just this weekend, I actually asked my dad, I'm like, why did they agree to the medicine chest? And because of the research he has done, he said it's because they were scared of smallpox and they were scared of diseases that would happen within the reserves. They didn't want them spreading to the settlers. So it was in their best interest from the negotiating point of view to give them this medicine chest. But again, it's not literally a medicine chest, right? It's not 1876 anymore, right? It's 2013. So it's the best medical care that's available. That's what our leaders asked for and negotiated for. And we're told that, yes, you can have that, right? And so the other thing I was asking my dad this weekend, I was like, so how did we determine territory? How did treaty territory get determined, right? And he said it's a combination of how what we understood our territory boundaries to be, right? And it's not lines on, it's not necessarily lines on a map the way we understand geography today. It was much more fluid. And there was these gray zones and there was neutral zones and all of those sorts of things. But we did have a pretty good sense of where those were. But he said it was also from the government negotiators' point of view, the railroad. Like Treaty 4 went through in 1874 because they needed the railroad to go through, right? Nation building, John A. Macdonald's legacy, right? Coast to coast, claim the land, claim the West, right? So that's the, but I knew that, I had heard that before and read that before, but what he told me is with Treaty 6, it's actually the telegraph lines. That's what went through Treaty 6 territory, and that was what was pushing them to settle and make treaty and Treaty 6 as well. So there was a design there, right? They weren't coming in a benign sort of, we really want to help you kind of mentality. It was like, okay, this is the land we need. These are the resources we need, and this is what we're going to do to get them. Ironically, of course, for those of you that may have known your history, 1876 was when Treaty 6 was concluded, which was also the date that the Indian Act was passed, which basically opposed almost every treaty right that came into being during the treaty negotiations. So on one hand, you've got the treaty commissioner saying and making promises. On the other hand, you've got the lawmakers saying, okay, that's just all. We're going to overcome that with these, with this legislation that came through. And so things like reserves on the schools became residential schools, right? Which is not what we asked for. Provisions weren't given in the way. The land that was promised, there were very specific land formulas that were based on population that, according to oral history, were to continue to grow as the population grew, right? It wasn't based at the population at the time, but it was meant to continue as the population grew, that we would have this land that we needed to continue life as we had, right, in the best possible way. Of course, none of that ended up in the written version, right? And so we still have these sort of ongoing discussions from a federal point of view, who now represents the Crown and First Nations, right? And so we have bodies like the Office of the Treaty Commission, Manitoba, now Alberta's talking about setting something up to try and attempt to find some sort of space in between that everybody agrees to, which hasn't been happening, right? Because people are becoming more, we weren't allowed to go to university, right? Which is why when I went to find my mother, it was really, I hired a lawyer, hired one of the very first Cree Indian lawyer in Saskatchewan is who I hired. And he found my mom in 2 weeks because there was, I think, 6 treaty women going to university the year I was born. So it was that easy. It was a process of elimination. And I think she was his second phone call to find me. So there's a reason for that, right? We weren't given access to universities. People, of course, were in residential school, which were, if we know our history, essentially child labor camps in many ways, right? And all of the abuse that we're hearing about finally, which has been interesting, even as a student of residential schools and learning about them, and I made a documentary about them. It's been so interesting to see the shift of what people could talk about even 10 years ago, right? And the space that's been opened up for people to talk about it. And really it comes down to, there's a lot of factors, but I remember interviewing elders, 10 years ago and saying, I don't think anyone's going to believe what I'm going to say, right? There was this sort of big, black, thick blanket that covered that truth, right? And it's, through people's continual efforts, right? To be brave, to say the things they had, to work through their shame, to be able to speak to it. And then also on the other side, being listened to, right? It's a two-way situation. So that's been really interesting. So as a result, we see now these waves of people who are educated not only in the Western way, right, but in our own ways as well. And I stand up here as somebody who's out of balance even, right? I'm like 6 months away from having my PhD, which on one level is, I'm finding it really interesting now that I'm close to finishing. And, even in my own community, the congratulations, oh, you're gonna be a doctor, and I'm like, there's a little bit of pedestal stuff happening, and I'm like, whoa, I'm climbing down. I'm like, no, because I'm out of balance. Yeah, I might have a PhD, and I might have learned this Western way, but all of that time I've had to put into doing that, what's become apparent to me is what I've had to neglect, right? Which is the development of this other knowledge, right? And so there, I'm like, I'm maybe not a toddler anymore. I used to call myself a toddler. I think maybe I'm his age, or maybe I'm 6 in my knowledge, right? And I'm like, but I'm 40. I should be at a 40-year-old's knowledge, and I'm not, right? And I understand the reasons for that, and I understand the history for that, and I'm not, I try not to be hard on myself, but it's also an acknowledgement. One of the sayings that happens in Saskatchewan a lot, and I think it's here too, is that education is our buffalo, right? The buffalo are gone, and so education takes that place, and that's how we have our livelihood. Well, my master's thesis, respectfully, because it's elders and others who talk about that, and I don't mean to disrespect them. However, I think how that statement gets interpreted is that Western education is our buffalo. And what gets left out of that is that our own ways, right? Our own histories, our own knowledges. And like that power of the pen that the old people asked for, right? It wasn't that we gave one up to get the other. That should never have happened. And so we're all sort of still working to bring that back to balance, which is how I understand Idle No More to be. So I've known Nina and Sheila for quite a few years. And I've known Sheila through her anti-racism and the kind of work she's done there. I know Nina through powwow, actually. We'd run into each other. We have a lot of mutual friends. And I met Sylvia a few years ago. And, just talking about recovery of these stories. And one of the projects I was working on was I was really interested in how our knowledge has survived, right? It's been so attacked, it's been so suppressed, right? How is it kept going, right? And obviously it's the strength, it's the prayers, there's reasons for it. But I've also been interested in sort of seeing some of the past that knowledge has taken. And one of them is actually people who resisted the residential school and hid their kids. If there was a young child that was identified as being gifted, as being someone who could carry the knowledge, there are times when that child would be hidden, would be taken out by a grandparent out to the bush, or just they'd disappear at the time that the trucks would come to get children. And so that's Sylvia's history. So I met Sylvia through that because I was working on the research for that project, and I went out and met her parents and spoke to them about how they had not gone to residential school. And so I think, people have been critical of the name Idle No More. partly because there has been a history of resistance, right? We don't necessarily know about it. Even our own stories, we don't always hear about them, right? There are certain narratives that have made it through. I mean, through my own family, I've heard about my late grandfather who defied the pass system, the permit system, which meant you had to get permission to leave the reserve. He would just go, right? And he would take his horse and buggy, no money, no funding, right? But just go and visit all of the reserves and talk to them about, you know, we need to push forward. We need to organize. We need to come together. We come together as strength, right? The more of us together. And that's been ongoing, whether even at the time of treaties, right? Big Bear and other chiefs said, you know, we can get this isn't good enough. For what we're being asked to give up, this isn't good enough. Not that we're giving up the land, but that, you know, that we're agreeing to share this beautiful land that we've been on for so many generations. We need to get more. So he had tried to do that as well. So we see, you know, those times, we see what happened in the 40s, we see what happened when the white paper came in 1969 and the response that came out of that. Which was, again, another assimilation attempt. And we've also had people within our communities continually resisting, right? Whether it's development in their lands, right? We've seen that in Grassy Narrows, we've seen that in Oka, we've seen that in other communities. So people say, well, those people who've been fighting for so long are saying, well, we've never been idle. And it's true. There are people who have never been idle, who have always been pushing, right? And in multiple ways, whether it's fighting for education, whether it's fighting for the land, whether it's fighting for women and children, right, and their safety. Because as we know, we have a history of violence here. We like to push that on the states all the time, but it's just as violent here. It's just more hidden, right? So it's true. There are people that have always pushed and always fought. But I think where the name Idle No More comes from is that, and I include myself in that. Even though I've tried to learn and I've been somewhat active, you know, I haven't been totally idle. But I think also it's so easy to be complacent, right? We're encouraged in everywhere we look to not see clearly, right? We're encouraged, even as, you know, and I'm just as guilty with kids, right? We're encouraged, oh, watch TV, you know, escape. There's all these comforts of things that we can do in our lives that we don't have to look around and see those hard truths, right? And I think there's many of us that have been sort of doing that. And so how I see and how I understand Idle No More is really, it's an awakening, right? It's a remembering. It's instead of turning our head and looking the other way, we're looking and seeing those truths. And if we don't know them, we're starting to ask for them. What are those truths, right? There's also an underlying of spirit with Idle No More. And people have talked about that too. You know, well, why, you know, how is this different from Occupy? Or how is this different? And the best way I can understand it, and what I've been told, because I've been starting to ask these questions back home, is that just as there were spirit and the sacred elements of treaty, just as there's been these you know, a spirit that's been with our people, people are remembering that we need to ask for help, that we need to put that out there. And so I've seen that happen with understanding that with the drum. I've seen that and been told that all of the prayers that are being asked for across the way, not just locally here, but across the country, across North America. And it really is. It's time, right? It's time for us as Indigenous people, for those of us that have been sort of averting our eyes sometimes, or taking the easy way, or buying in to this push that we get. For those of us that do well, and I'll just again go back to me. I mean, I had a lot of opportunity given to me because I was adopted out. I had a lot of support to do this kind of work, to be educated. And from a very young age, I've been pushed by Indian Affairs, by other organizations, to be a role model, right? They use that, oh, you're a role model, oh, you're successful, you're a role, and it gets that whole pedestal thing. And I was always uncomfortable with it. And I didn't have the critical understanding at that point, but what I did say to myself is, you know, I've had a different experience, and to put me up here, it sort of gives that sort of narrative of deficiency or what's the word I'm looking for? Merit, right? You know, you start participating in a meritocracy. Well, if you're good enough, you can be up here, which doesn't begin to talk about, you know, the oppression that's happened, the inequality, the injustices that are out there. And so, again, I didn't, at that point when I was like, I think 25, I didn't totally understand that, but I do now, right? And I see it continuing to happen, and I see our people, because we've been separated from our understandings of who we are and how we work together as nations, because we've been encouraged to look to being validated and participating in a meritocracy, we sometimes, you know, we're needing to reconnect also. But what helps, and what, you know, what is, you know, what's so great about events like this is that so often, and I can't, honestly, if I had $1 for every time somebody non-native asked me, so what's the solution? Because, I mean, I still am really a part of my adoptive community, and I have all my friends still from university, and I interact in a non-native community all the time. I mean it. I would literally, I don't know what I would do. I don't know. I'd travel probably with all the money I'd have from being asked, what's the solution, right? Or tell me about this. Tell me about this. Educate me. And sometimes in a really demanding way. You need to tell me. You need to make me understand why, right? And it's been like that. I've been talked to in that tone by somebody of privilege who's saying, look, I don't got the time to go and do my own research, okay? You're going to tell me, right? And so it's been really frustrating, I'll say that. And so what's so great is that you're here. You know, you've made that effort to come here. You're not sitting back and demanding that, you know, the handful of us in the room, you know, say, okay, this is, you know, across the table or whatever. You're coming to learn. And I'm only telling you a little bit because, you know, I'm sharing what little I know in a short time. But then then it becomes your responsibility, right? To learn more about some of the stuff I've said and some of the stuff you're going to hear tonight from the others who are here. And that's what's needed, right? We can't do all of this on our own. It's not all on our shoulders. And people want to put it on all our shoulders. People want us to solve everything. Solve your problem. It's your problem. You solve it. It's like, no, you know, this isn't our problem, right? This isn't the Indian problem. This is a problem of the land, right? This is a problem of you know, this place that we now call Canada, right? I have a Blackfoot teacher. I'm not a very good student of Blackfoot language, so I can't remember the word. And he knows I can't remember, so he's told me he'll teach me again when I see him next. But there's a word he taught me, and I can't say it properly. So I'm just going to tell you what it means. It means they got here yesterday. And the old Blackfoot people use that when they're talking about settlers. They got here yesterday. And it's not meant in a demeaning way, right? It's not meant to put people down or to diminish, you know, what I understand to be a real connection to this place. I understand that. I grew up watching that with my grandpa. But it does sort of give you a different perspective of the history of this land, right? And the people that have lived here when you think about a continuum of time, right? And so, you know, when I think about all of these centennials that have been happening, and I think it's probably been happening in Manitoba just as it happened in Saskatchewan, where there's so much money went into celebrating these 100 years, historic 100 years, and it's like, okay, you know, all right. But really, you know, when we think about the traditions and the art and the stories and the interaction with the land that's been going on, and you know, it's mind-boggling, right, to think of that. And so it's my hope that what Idle No More becomes, and I see it happening, is that it's not just an awakening for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous activists to not be idle anymore, but it's basically for everybody. It's a call for everybody, right? It's not an Indigenous movement. It might have started that way in some way, but I mean, Sheila McLean is a self-described settler, right, of Scottish origins, and understands herself to be a member of Treaty, living in Treaty 6 territory and having responsibilities to that land. And that's really what it is. It's reminding us that when settlers came, we understood that we would share information back and forth, that we would share that ethic of mutual responsibility, of giving back, of the obligations that we all have to this land and to the inhabitants of this land. And not just humans, right? We tend to think it's always just about us. It's all about people, right? But it's not. It's about our other relatives, right? And just imagine how different this land would be if people had come and been open and understood that we are in relationship with everything that lives on this land. They are our relatives, and we need to think about them and their well-being. How would this be different, right? I'll leave it with that. So thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
You were saying that you knew a few things about the treaties,
Mm-hmm.
and I know that there's so much to know about that. But do you have a number of, like maybe in your head or that you've come across that some of those provisions that weren't met? I know like it's higher than what they say.
There's the land, which is the treaty land entitlement, which is here and in Saskatchewan, where the land formulas, and it varies treaty to treaty, but it's usually 125 acres per person for a family of 5. Was the agreed upon number. I think it's different in the earlier treaties. That often didn't happen, and people were short. The reserves were the land set aside was shortchanged. So treaty land entitlement has been the effort to get that land back. There's issues with that process because of that oral history that the land will always grow, and so there's a differing of opinion of whether that should happen or not, right? But the process has been to get that land back. It's not land that was stolen after the fact. It was just land that was never given at the time. Annuities were promised. So much money per person and a lot of times those didn't come through. The farming aspect of it, there's actually, Sarah Carter wrote a really great book called Lost Harvest. If you're interested, if you have a farming history in your family, I'd suggest you read that, because it goes into what wasn't allowed to happen. That, our narrative is that Indian people failed, right? We were just not developed enough to succeed in this modern contemporary world, and we were doomed to fail, right? That's the narrative, and it's everywhere, and we see it everywhere, and we see it replicated everywhere, especially in media, right? The reality is we did really well. We did really well as farmers. We adapted really quickly, and we were successful because we understood that relationship. We knew the weather, we knew the land, we knew what would grow. Anishinaabe people were great gardeners. They were amazing gardeners. They have a long history of that, right? But what happened is they did so well that people got jealous, people complained, and so all of a sudden it was made law, well, you can't sell your produce. You can't sell what you produce. You can't leave the reserve to go and sell what you've done. You can't sell a cow. You need permission to sell a cow. So all of these, it was just so like micromanaged and hindered. So that was not part of treaty. That part, we were to have flourished. That was part of the understanding that we have that right to do well. Yeah.
So there's a handful that we're aware of, but just because the treaties are so extensive and in depth.
Yeah. And there's different things that happen. No, like across the board from 1 to 11. No, and it's different in different circumstances too. I think because with the North, like the treaties 8 and 9 and 10, that's resources. I'm less familiar with those. Yeah. Yeah. Any other? Yes.
Well, my question is also related to land. Mm-hmm. And I'm very vague about, there's reserve land, mm-hmm. and then there's, what was the understanding of Aboriginal people when they were to share the land, and mm-hmm. how does that impact the right to the benefit of resource development?
Mm-hmm. That's a big question because of the depth of the plow, right? That it was understood that it was because at the time also when they were coming at the in the 1870s, it was about agriculture. It was about opening the land for settlement, because if you had the land settled, the United States couldn't come and try and take the land, right? It was about nation building. Oops, sorry. It was about having that land claimed and having people living on the land, because that's the best way. It's why the Inuit people were relocated. Like there's stories of that southern Arctic people were literally relocated to these remote places that they didn't know, they didn't have any knowledge of, they'd never been there, it wasn't their territory, but it was about Arctic sovereignty, right? It was Canadian sovereignty. So it was similar with the West. It was having people living on the land so that it was claimed as Canadian, right? And at that time it was really just agriculture. And this is, again, my depth of knowledge is pretty limited to the sort of prairie treaties.
Mm-hmm.
What do you need? I'm almost done. I've got one more, maybe a couple more questions, okay?
Can I tell you something?
Mm-hmm.
Is there internet?
No.
Darn it.
Okay. Modern kid, yeah. Oh, he's a master negotiator, I swear. Could have had him at the treaties. No.
I'm okay.
Yeah. So there is a big question about that, right? About what happens with what's under the ground. And in 1930, the Canada and the National Resource Transfer Act put the resources in the realm of the province, but they actually, according to oral history, they didn't have the right to do that because that hadn't actually been part of the treaties. So that's under dispute.
When people live on a reserve, that's one use of the land, but
so the reserves were meant, and there's a Cree word, skunakan, which is meant land set aside. Sometimes people call it leftover land even. And that's the land that we were told that was just ours, that nobody could come and, and that's what we know as reserves today, right? But they were supposed to be quite a bit bigger. And if you look at an early map of the reserves in the prairies, it's astonishing to look at an early map and to look at the maps today. And, think of it in terms of a blanket. The reserves were these big blankets that are now tiny patchworks because of land that's been surrendered, which is just a fancy word for stolen, right? And that's the basis of the land claims that are happening now. Then, as I said, there's treaty land entitlement where they didn't get, if they're supposed to get this much, they only got this much, right? So that's land set aside. But it was never part of the understanding that it was to be, the rest of Canada that falls under the number of treaties was surrendered, right? That's what ended up in the text, was that they were surrendered. But oral history says, no, we never agreed to surrender anything. We agreed to share this leftover, what's here. And that we agreed that we would mutually benefit. And we would agree we would live in a kinship relationship.
So does that imply that there should be mutual decision-making on how that land is used?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you very much for talking about the relationship with the buffalo and the buffalo's history, telling some of the buffalo's history. And I'm really interested in your talk about the giving back and the reciprocity. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about what the traditions tell, the oral traditions might have to say, the elders might have to say about what would be given back to the buffalo in terms of songs or stories, or how would that reciprocity work there, if you could talk about that.
I don't think I can go into it very much, but what I would say is prayer.
Can you please repeat the question?
The question was in the relationship of reciprocity between, she was interested in the buffalo and the relationship that existed there. What was given back in terms of the buffalo, and what I just said is I can't go into it too much, but what I would be okay, I think, to say is that prayers, that ceremony was part of the process of giving back. One of the things I've been doing is there's big glyph stones that are in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Montana. And similar, I haven't been out there yet, that's my plan to go in the spring, but similar to the petroglyphs that are out east of here, There's some petroglyphs too in southern Saskatchewan and in an hour south of Lethbridge, writing on stone, the Blackfoot. There's pictographs and petroglyphs. Pictographs are the paint, and petroglyphs are the carvings in the stone. But there are also glyph stones or rib stones, and they're large stones that are in the shape of buffalo, and there's rib markings in the stones, and there's little like cupules in the stones as well. So myself and Kwana have been to about 6, but there's more, but there's not a lot. And so we have relationship and stories that go with some of them. Some of them I haven't been able to find them yet. That doesn't mean they're not there. It's just maybe it means I'm not that good of a researcher, but there's stories and connections to those stones. But what I've been told and how I understand them is that they're calling stones, and that, you know, people talk about, and it's very prevalent that, oh, we're nomads, we wandered the land aimlessly. Well, no, we had really specific patterns of movement that we followed, and we had our summer camp areas and our winter camp areas, and we had our ways of bringing the buffalo to us as well, right? It wasn't always us. Sometimes we followed them, but we also had our ways of bringing them to us. And those stones are involved in that. So I saw my first one in 2004, and I had a completely different path of research and ideas, and it shifted. So buffalo's been my focus since then. Yes.
I was wondering about education as a treaty right, and I'm wondering, I know there are some federal court cases about the inequality, but I'm wondering if you know of any reserve or treaty area that has challenged the federal government about the terrible inequality in funding for education on reserves.
There's been pushes for that. Specific examples I don't have, but maybe one of the other speakers might know more. I think that until recently, a lot of things didn't go to courts because, you know, there was a fear of how the decision goes, right? And having to, so I think it's only been since Delgamuukw in the 90s that changed things, when all of a sudden our oral history is weighted in the court. Otherwise, because of course, you know, who benefits from the physical documents and what they say, right? They're all written by government officials and so our oral history hasn't always been encountered. So it's only been recently that people are, you know, the court's starting to make decisions. That being said, there's also those that feel that we have our own, and it's a difficult situation, because especially now when we're really looking at asserting and understanding ourselves to be, you know, whatever the word, sometimes people use sovereign, sometimes people use autonomous, sometimes people use nationhood. So it's a challenging thing where we're wanting to abide by our own understandings and our own laws, but yet we live in a space that is governed by this, you know, what we know as the Canadian system. But we're seeing that more. I mean, there's been more and more specific court challenges around some of the elements of treaty. So it'll be interesting, but there might be, but I just don't know offhand. Yeah. Oh, okay. I can't see out through the light.
Yeah, it is pretty great.
Yeah. So like you spoke about that, sort of that the dichotomy between living in this Canadian context and being forced to sort of negotiate in a culturally different way. And how do you see that like evolving into like a winning strategy for First Nations people? Like, is that...
What's the solution?
Well, I guess... I'm just kidding. Is there a winning strategy, or does the game sort of need to be changed in order to have real change?
I don't, you know, I think that I tend to be, and again, I come from a very specific place, right, because of my history and stuff. So for me, I'm really, I don't know if there's a winning strategy, first of all. I don't know. I think that, and how I've come to understand it, is that colonization and its current forms, because it's still here, right? Very strong. I mean, people try and say, oh, Canada's post-colonial. No, it's not. It's totally not post-colonial. So it's evolved. And so how I understand it is impacts us in multiple ways, and that in order to push back, there has to be multiple strategies. And I think that part of what is happening with Idle No More is that we're starting to really explore what our other strategies are, right? People have been using the same strategies, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And I think what's happening within the movement and within the different areas that it's happening, using the resources they have, using the fact that everybody's coming together. I just met with Wanda Nanabush, who's an organizer in the Toronto Idle No More movement, and we were talking about how nations that have traditionally not really gotten along, you know, there's a historical thing, are working together, are saying, you know what, that's the past, this is a new movement, we need these new alliances, and we're going to work together to come up with things. So, you know, if I could sort of just say one thing, I think that's what it would be, is that these alliances that are happening, continuing, because I think everybody's been pushing back in different multiple ways, but it's about, there's certain times, I think, when we all need to come together and push back together. So that's mine, but I don't, you know, I think that I think we're just, that's part of the process too, right? And just as we shift and change, unfortunately, the government is, and all of those forces are just as quick sometimes to shift around and figure out ways. And really, you know, it does come down to that. It comes down to resources, right? But we don't understand them necessarily in the same way, right? So that's as far as I think I can go with that.
I just want to add a little bit to that. Thank you. And I think it also goes back to you as the people that are here wanting to know more. And I think it's up to you also to engage in conversations with First Nations, you know, and where they are and what they're doing in their communities and how you can help in that. But also to educate, you know, one another, your family, your communities, your nations. We talked about nation to nation, you know, how we work together as nation to nation. We can work with the Haudenosaunee, we can work with the Mi'kmaq, we can work with the Haida. But you also come from different nations. And how can you work with us? You know, that's up to you. And there's so many levels of things that you can work at. You can work at the racism that's out there, you know, which Idle No More has brought out. Mm-hmm. So much racism. We pretend it doesn't exist, but all these institutions are based on racism that targets us as a people. So that's one area that somebody could work at and say, let's do some anti-racism, just like Sheila. You know, there's many of those things that you can work at. So with that, I just want to give it back to you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And that made me think of something else, because there's always this ongoing debate around who is a settler, right? And I mean, I think sometimes there's issues around the word, and people understand it to be those people whose parents or grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents came and settled, like literally the first time. But there's also a strain that talks about like Canada's continually being settled, right? Because we have people coming here all the time. And just as the people who have grown up here haven't been educated in this history, right? So is the same with people who are just getting here. And in fact, I would say that the state is invested in that truth not being shared, right? So it's again, it's always changing, it's always shifting. And so, you know, I'm really happy that Chickadee said that, because again, it's always put on us to educate everybody, right? And we're individuals, right? We can do so much, but that's what we need is people talking about what they're learning, sharing it. And I know it's not easy, you know. I just went home and, you know, half my family make their living from either the tar sands or the oil or the potash, right? And it's like, you know, you know, those are really difficult conversations to have. I'll say it right now. They're hard conversations because, you know, people see their livelihoods being threatened. And yet, you know, it's about sort of exposing the injustice that comes with those livelihoods, right? The inequality that comes the impact that it has. You know, so, you know, absolutely, you know, we can, that's a huge thing that can be done, you know, as far as taking responsibility for this as well. Yeah. Okay.
There's probably more questions, but we've arrived at a point where I think that we're just about ready to have a break. Tasha, that was absolutely wonderful. And Chickadee, thanks for adding that. I feel so strongly that Idle No More is helping to wake up those of us who are not Indigenous. Those of us who are white-skinned, people of color, whose ancestors have come here or come here themselves, and we have a lot of work to do. And I'm just so thankful for an evening like this and for Tasha to come and yet for the rest of the evening to unfold. So if you still have questions, you know, we have a break coming up. Please nourish your bodies as well as your minds. Help yourself to something to eat, dialogue and commune with one another, and look after nature if you need to. So about 15 minutes or so, we'll have a bit of a break.